This is clearly a depopulation thing. By whom? That's where you get to the real evil here.
Yes.
I've stopped even talking mostly about the data because they don't care. They just want to kill the children. In years to come, if you don't know that your great-grandfather took this shot, it turns out this thing called gene drive, it has to do with CRISPR-Cas9, and it's probably in there. We found, in fact, I got somebody handed me, in fact, I won't say who, but because I think the people want to be anonymous, but these are big-time geneticists, you can tell, because they know what they're doing. And when they looked at the actual stuff in there, it's not clear this ever made the spike protein of SARS-CoV-2. That may just be smoke and mirrors. It's a Trojan horse, because they looked at you. To make a protein, you have what's called an open reading frame. And just like a sentence starts with a capital letter and ends with a period, okay? And you read the sentence starting at the beginning and ending at the period. Well, it makes sense. If you start putting capital letters and periods all over the inside, it doesn't make sense. And that's what they found out looking at this stuff. They looked at the comernity because that is, not the comernity, they didn't look at a vial. They looked at the gene sequence that was put up by Pfizer and the WHO as the active ingredient in their vaccines, okay? Mm. And this active ingredient is supposed to be the mRNA that makes spike protein. And that's supposed to give you immunity. That all is nonsense probably to begin with. But in any case, it doesn't appear this even makes spike protein, because within the open reading frame, they found all these start and stop codons that shouldn't be there. And that's just by going to standard gene data banks, okay, like the Sanger Institute. You got to love that name. But all these different ones. There's the BLAST, and there's that one, and there's a bunch of other ones. And you can look for different things in these because they have different research aims. And so when they did that, they first found that there were all these start and stop codons were coded in this inside of this open reading fragment. Then when they looked inside those, they found it coded for things like mutant measles virus, or mutant measles genetics, I won't call it a virus, hypothetical proteins, things that don't exist in nature, that only exist on a computer, that should never be in a vaccine. And then the last one that's really of concern is a thing called guided RNA. Instead of mRNA, it actually makes gRNA, and you could tell where the guided RNA is supposed to go, and it was guided towards two of our genes, human genes. So what that does is take these pieces of this abnormal genetic stuff, it guides it and puts it into, it's a double-stranded cut, it puts it into both of our strands. And so when you have your children 100%, not 50%, but 100% get the abnormal gene. In nature, God protects our genome by making it so that it dilutes out unusual genetic. If you get an accidental, if something inserts an accident, you have a little break or something in radiation, or something gets in there and it inserts a little genetic sequence that shouldn't be there, within a few generations it's gone, because you just don't give it to all your children. But that's why they call it gene drive individuals. So here's the problem for Dr. Northrup's dating services. It will work initially if nobody has actually been vaccinated and is honestly telling you that. But because they've shortened our lifespans artificially over the millennium, we don't live long enough to transmit the actual knowledge of what happened, the great DNA war of 2020 to 2024, or whatever this is going to turn out to be. It's, like our grandparents we don't even have people that remember World War II. So you don't have this you don't have this memory, and you can't transmit it to the next generation and say, you have somebody in the family. I'm a child that got this abnormal gene from my mother. So you definitely have it because of this gene drive. And they won't know that. So they'll get into the dating pool, and literally within 10 generations, we will all have this abnormal gene or genes, whatever they put into us. So that's where we are right now. It's a really, really bad situation. Now, I don't want to speak too long, but just on the 1918 thing, the reason that's important to consider is it's the same psychopaths and it's the same technique. And so, interestingly, and I don't know that he's any relation to, I think he is, but I can't prove that, that the doctor I'm going to talk about is related to Bill Gates, but it does seem like he probably is, like a nephew or something. So it turns out that in 1913, this guy named Frederick Gates, Dr. Frederick Gates, he graduated from Johns Hopkins medical school. And actually, to go back a little bit further, just for fun, Frederick, his middle name was Lamar, so it's easy not to get him mixed up with other people. But he was accepted to all these Ivy League schools, but he started at the University of Chicago and then transferred to Yale, where he was awarded the Andrew D. White Award. And I just bring that out because White was a member of the Order of Skull and Bones. And Gates then graduated with honors from Johns Hopkins. And when the war broke out and we joined it in 1917, World War I, he volunteered for the Army Medical Corps. But guess what? He was commissioned first lieutenant. And guess his first job? This is, having been in the military, this is not how you come out of medical school and start. He went to the Rockefeller Institute staff. Now, why would this happen? Because his father was Frederick Taylor Gates, was the personal assistant to John D. Rockefeller. And Frederick Taylor Gates changed his name a couple times. That's why it's hard to associate him with the current Bill Gates, and there may be a reason for that. But because Frederick Gates, who actually was a minister, and actually from my alma mater, the University of Rochester, he's credited with getting Rockefeller involved in organized medicine. He set up the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research. He designed the Rockefeller Foundation and then became a trustee. And as you know, the Rockefeller Foundation is deep into this whole thing. Well, according to Dr. Gates's memorial biography, it says that he gave lectures to military groups at the Rockefeller Institute and, quote, was assigned to visit training camps. But what they don't tell you is that what he really did, he was the primary investigator on the vaccines given at Fort Riley, Kansas, prior to the outbreak of the so-called pandemic. So to summarize what I found out looking at this is that the shots were given because they set up a medical school in October of 17, right after Dr. Gates was part of this whole Rockefeller thing. They set up an Army medical school, and suddenly they started to have outbreaks of typhoid fever. Now, if you look at what happened in Ukraine, when we took over those bioweapons labs, suddenly every time they'd get this thing going, they'd get something rehabbed, they'd have these weird diseases break out among the population, hantavirus, equine encephalitis, stuff that wasn't over there. Similarly, typhoid fever could have come back from Panama, but really I'm not convinced. But anyway, and then in response to the fever, a whole bunch of people were given typhoid shots by the State Board of Health. And then the next month, they started having meningitis. So what do we see with these vaccines? You get neurologic complications. So the Army and Navy estimated that 36 to 40% of their personnel got meningitis. That's not normal. Normally, meningitis is a 1 or 2 person thing. So they got it after they took these typhoid vaccines. This whole thing broke out with meningitis. And then what did they do? They responded with these homemade kind of crazy meningitis vaccines developed at the Rockefeller Institute and provided by Dr. Gates, who was never mentioned on the Camp Funston, Fort Riley, as actually administering them. But he was the guy in the background because he's published a research paper all about this. And if you read it, it's just really disgustingly homemade vaccines. But that's what started this. And it's the opinion of Dr. Eleanor Bean, who was a child at the time, said nobody died that didn't take these vaccines. Now, the other thing there are 3 things. Aspirin was involved because it was given to decrease fever and cause bleeding. But that's probably the least important here. The other one was, just like today we have 5G, back then they had telegrapher's disease because suddenly, what were these guys sent down to Camp Funston, Fort Riley for? They were being trained on the telegram. And so it was an observation of the doctors at the time that the people who were really dying of this weren't they weren't the little scrawny kids from the city. They were these big, brawny farm kids that you would expect to survive anything, right? But you see, the body responds to rate of change. And so the city kids had already had some electrification around them. They had city lights. They had things that were giving them EMF. But the farm kids coming out of the hills in Tennessee and places, they had nothing. So they show up and their electromagnetic frequency exposures hits them and they start getting sick. And they were given the vaccines and then they died. It's just that simple. And I'm going to tell you, the other final point is that the news of the day was exaggerated just like today. By 2020 or by 1920, I search now with optical character recognition. They can digitize old newspapers, and you can search them. And they go by date. And when I put in influenza and pandemic, and I searched between 1917 and 1920, like 25, 30 newspaper articles, exactly the same wording in 1920 showed up. And in 1918, nobody was really writing much about this. They didn't see it as a big deal. But by 1920, the propaganda arm took off to make it a big deal. And they started putting these articles out in these little newspapers. And they all had exactly the same words. Now, in the